At 2:43 on Wednesday afternoon, Mike Lee walked onto the Senate floor and put 6 pages in front of J.D. Vance that threatened to change the entire procedural fight over the Save America Act. For 18 months, nearly every path forward had run through John Thune. Scheduling decisions, conference management, floor timing, all of it depended on whether the majority leader was willing to move. Lee's filing challenged that structure at its weakest point. Not around Thune. Not over Thune. Without him. Most senators were not even in the chamber when it happened. Senior Republican staff had not been expecting the move, and 3 senators meeting in Thune's office about September, scheduling reportedly learned about it from a junior staffer watching the floor feed. By the time Thune's floor team reached the chamber, the filing was already in the record. That mattered because Lee was not simply demanding another vote or making another floor speech. He was asking the presiding officer to recognize a motion that leadership had not scheduled. And the distinction at the center of his argument was simple enough to sound almost technical until you see what it could do. The Senate Majority Leader exercises enormous practical control over the floor, but much of that control rests on long-standing convention. When multiple senators seek recognition, the presiding officer traditionally recognizes the Majority Leader first. That practice has shaped Senate business for generations. Lee's filing argued that the practice is not the same thing as a binding constitutional command. The presiding officer of the Senate is the Vice President. And Lee's argument was that on a properly filed privileged motion involving election law, the Vice President retained independent authority to recognize a senator even without a leadership scheduling agreement. In plain English, Lee was asking Vance to let him move toward the Save America Act without waiting for Thune to give him the floor. That was the theory. But a filing by itself changed nothing. Everything now depended on the man sitting in the chair. Vance had 3 basic choices. He could decline to rule and send the matter back into the normal procedural machinery. He could reject Lee's argument and leave Thune's control of the schedule intact. Or he could sustain the point of order, recognize Lee, and allow the motion to proceed. The chamber then entered a 22-minute pause. Vance conferred with the parliamentarian's office. Several senior Republican senators moved toward the presiding officer's desk in what floor staff later described as an effort to intervene before the ruling. The institutional concern was obvious. This was not merely a fight over one bill. A ruling in Lee's favor could raise a much larger question about how far a vice president's recognition authority extends when it collides with the majority leader's control of the legislative calendar. Vance heard the argument. Then he chose option 3. He sustained Lee's point of order and recognized him to offer the motion to proceed to the Save America Act reconciliation vehicle. In that moment, the story changed. The bill Thune had been scheduling, delaying, and managing through an unsettled Republican conference was no longer sitting entirely behind the majority leader's calendar. A motion was now pending on the Senate floor. And that created a new problem for Thune because once the ruling was in the record, ignoring Lee was no longer the same thing as simply refusing to schedule the bill. That is where the procedural fight became much bigger than Mike Lee's filing. The immediate question was no longer whether Lee had found a way to challenge Thune's control of the calendar. Vance had already accepted that argument from the chair. The new question was whether that ruling could survive once the full Senate can confront it. And there was a serious objection. Critics of Vance's ruling argued that recognizing a privileged motion over the majority leader's objection could dramatically expand the vice president's role in Senate floor procedure. Their concern was not limited to the Save America Act. If a vice president can bypass the majority leader's scheduling preference whenever a qualifying motion is presented, then a future administration could potentially use the same logic to push its own priorities onto the floor against the wishes of its own Senate leadership. That institutional argument was real. The senators who approached Vance's desk during those 22 minutes were not simply objecting to the bill itself. They were challenging the precedent that could follow from the ruling, but the counter-argument in Lee's favor was just as fundamental. The vice president's position as president of the Senate does not come from a scheduling agreement negotiated by party leadership. Lee's filing relied on the distinction between Senate convention and constitutional authority. The majority leader's priority and recognition may be deeply established, but Lee argued that convention does not erase the presiding officer's independent power to recognize a properly presented privileged motion. Once Vance accepted that reading, Thune still had a weapon available. He could appeal. Under the procedure described in the filing fight, a ruling from the chair can be appealed to the full Senate. That means Vance's decision does not have to remain the final word simply because he issued it. The senators themselves can vote on whether to sustain or overturn the ruling. And that is where Lee's move created a political problem that was much harder to manage than another scheduling dispute. If Thune challenges Vance and the Senate sustains the ruling, then the motion to proceed remains alive. The bill moves deeper into the floor process, and Republican senators are forced to take a public position on whether they are willing to let that process continue. But if the Senate overturns Vance, Lee gets something else: a roll call. For most of this fight, opposition could hide inside procedure. Senators could say they supported the goals of the Save America Act while disagreeing over timing, reconciliation strategy, conference management, or the order in which leadership wanted to handle the bill. A direct appeal vote strips away much of that ambiguity. Sustain the chair, and the procedural pathway remains open. Overturn the chair, and there is a recorded vote showing exactly who stopped it. That is why the appeal is not necessarily an escape hatch for Thune. It could become the mechanism that destroys the middle ground he had been using to manage a divided conference. Lee's filing did more than create a new path to the floor. It changed the cost of blocking that path. Before Wednesday afternoon, delaying the bill could still be described as a scheduling decision. After Vance's ruling, blocking the motion could require senators to attach their names to a direct vote against the procedural route Lee had opened. That is the real pressure point. Thune had spent months balancing competing factions without forcing every internal disagreement into the congressional record. A clean appeal vote could end that protection instantly. And Lee appears to have understood that when he used this mechanism. The filing forced a choice that leadership had repeatedly avoided: either allow movement on the Save America Act or make the obstruction visible. That left Thune facing three possible paths before the Senate returned: appeal immediately and force the conference vote, try to delay the confrontation long enough to count votes and rebuild control, or negotiate with Lee before the pending motion reached the point where every Republican senator had to choose publicly. None of those options restored the position Thune held before 2:43 Wednesday afternoon. The filing was in the record. Vance's ruling was in the record. The motion was pending. And now, the fight was moving towards something the previous 18 months had repeatedly avoided: a moment when procedure could no longer hide the people making the decision. Thune's first option was the most direct: appeal the ruling himself and force the Senate to decide immediately whether Vance was right. That would produce clarity fast. It would also require the majority leader to stand on the floor and challenge a ruling issued by his own vice president on a bill the administration had treated as a top priority. Even if Thune believed the institutional argument against Vance was strong, the political optics of making that challenge were difficult to separate from the substance of the bill. His second option was delay. Thune could try to secure unanimous consent to table the appeal temporarily, buying time for leadership to count votes and assess whether the conference was prepared for a direct confrontation. Under normal circumstances, that kind of pause could restore some control. The problem was Mike Lee. If Lee objected, unanimous consent would fail. The appeal would remain unresolved, the motion would remain pending, and the procedural problem Thune was trying to contain would still be sitting on the floor waiting for him. That left the third option: negotiate. A deal would not require Thune to embrace Vance's ruling as a permanent expansion of vice presidential power. It would simply allow leadership and Lee to find a path that moved the Save America Act while avoiding an immediate conference-wide showdown over the ruling itself. The basic shape was straightforward. Thune could agree to a specific floor date for the Save America Act reconciliation vehicle, not another broad promise to deal with it sometime in September, but an actual date and start time. Lee could then withdraw his pending motion in favor of the leadership scheduled path. The immediate procedural confrontation would ease, but the ruling would remain. That is what made the potential compromise so important. Vance's decision would not vanish just because Lee withdrew the motion. It would stay in the record as something leadership had already watched the vice president use once. And that meant every future scheduling conversation over this bill would take place under a different set of incentives. If leadership stalled again, Lee would know the mechanism existed. Vance had already shown that he was willing to sustain it. The leverage was no longer theoretical. That was the real change Wednesday afternoon produced. For months, the fight over the Save America Act had been shaped by delays, internal divisions, and repeated attempts to find a path that could keep enough Republicans together without forcing every disagreement into the open. Now the pressure was moving in the opposite direction. The closer the Senate moved toward a direct ruling or appeal vote, the harder it became for reluctant senators to remain publicly supportive of the bill's goals while privately avoiding the floor process required to advance it. And that mattered beyond the chamber. The political calendar was shrinking. McConnell and Tillis were both retiring, and the races to replace them were part of a broader midterm environment in which Republican candidates were running on a simple promise: deliver what the current conference had not. The source's political argument is not that every Senate race turned on this single bill. It is that repeated deferral created a growing credibility problem for a party telling voters it intended to act. That pressure was especially important because the group that had once blocked the bill had already changed. Collins had crossed over on the clean bill in June. McConnell and Tillis were leaving. That left Murkowski as the remaining member of the original four holdouts still positioned inside the conference. And Vance's ruling altered the procedural environment around her as well. The presiding officer, whose authority had previously operated inside the same leadership framework, was now on record accepting Lee's argument that his recognition power could operate independently of Thune's scheduling preference in this specific fight. That did not force Murkowski to change her position. It did make the old procedural shelter less comfortable. Meanwhile, Republican candidates in states including Montana, Nevada, Michigan, Arizona, and Pennsylvania had another reason to watch what happened next. Every additional delay risked reinforcing the same criticism the party had been trying to escape, that Republicans could campaign on the Save America Act more easily than they could move it through their own Senate conference. Wednesday afternoon broke that pattern in one important respect. This was not another promise to act later. It was an actual procedural move. And whether that move became a scheduled vote, an appeal, or a negotiated settlement now depended on what Thune did when the Senate reconvened. When the Senate returned Thursday morning, Thune's problem was no longer theoretical. The motion was pending. Vance's ruling was already in the record, and the next move belonged to leadership. For 18 months, Thune had been able to manage this fight by controlling when the Save America Act reached the floor, how much pressure individual senators faced, and whether internal disagreements became public votes. That flexibility had been one of his most valuable tools. Lee's filing narrowed it dramatically. Every path now carried a visible cost. If Thune accepted the ruling and allowed the floor process to continue, the bill moved closer to the vote-a-rama Lee had been trying to force. If he appealed, the Senate would have to decide publicly whether to sustain or overturn Vance and Republican senators who had spent months avoiding a clean procedural confrontation would suddenly have their names attached to one. If Thune tried to negotiate, he would have to offer Lee something concrete enough to justify withdrawing a motion. Lee had already succeeded in getting recognized. Doing nothing was the one option that no longer worked. That was the most important change. Before Wednesday, inaction could still be disguised as management, more meetings, more vote counting, more scheduling discussions, another promise that the bill would move when the conference was ready. Now there was an unresolved motion sitting on the floor. The procedural fight had caught up with the political one, and the administration's position had changed the pressure inside the conference as well. Vance had not merely listened to Lee's argument. He had sustained it from the chair, putting the vice president's authority directly into the dispute over whether leadership could continue delaying the bill. That ruling did not guarantee passage. It did not erase opposition. It did not solve every vote problem, but it removed one excuse that had dominated the fight: the idea that no procedural path existed unless Thune chose to create one. According to the sequence laid out in this fight, Lee had now demonstrated a path. Vance had validated it from the chair. The remaining question was what Republican leadership would do with it. That is why the significance of the filing went beyond the 6 pages Lee handed over at 2:43. For months, outside pressure had failed to break the scheduling logjam. Trump's public demands had not done it. Lee's speeches had not done it. Shutdown pressure had not done it. Previous deals had not produced the final movement supporters wanted. Every one of those efforts still depended, in the end, on Thune deciding when the Senate would act. This one did not begin with his permission. That distinction is what made Wednesday different from the previous failed attempts. Lee had found a mechanism that placed a motion before the chamber first and forced leadership to respond second. The order had reversed. Instead of bill supporters asking Thune when he would permit the fight to begin, Thune was now deciding how to react to a fight that had already reached the floor. And that is where the numbers become politically dangerous. The argument was no longer simply whether supporters could claim they had enough votes. It was no longer simply whether leadership could point to some future procedural route. A motion existed. A ruling existed. And an appeal, if Thune chose one, could put the entire conference on the record. That was the pressure Lee had spent months trying to create. Not another statement of support. Not another scheduling promise. A decision. The source frames the June vote as having already answered the question of whether the raw support existed, although the reference to vote number 151 is ambiguous in the transcript and should not be read more specifically than the text supports. What Wednesday added was a procedural confrontation that could no longer be managed entirely behind closed doors. By Wednesday night, the battlefield had changed. Thune had begun the day with a practical ability to decide when this bill would reach the floor. He ended it facing a vice presidential ruling he could challenge, negotiate around, or accept, but could no longer pretend had never happened. And the next decision would determine whether the Save America Act finally entered the floor fight its supporters had been demanding, or whether Republican senators would be forced into the clean public vote leadership had spent months avoiding. Turned out 85%. That clean public vote is exactly what this fight had avoided again and again. Trump's public pressure had not produced it. Lee's floor speeches had not produced it. The shutdown threat had not produced it. Even the Friday night deal still required leadership to turn political pressure into actual floor action. Every route eventually came back to the same gatekeeper, John Thune. That is why Lee's filing was different from the previous attempt. It did not ask Thune to change his mind first. It created a procedural situation that required Thune to respond after the motion had already reached the floor. For the first time in this 18-month fight, supporters of the Save America Act had a mechanism operating outside the majority leader's ordinary scheduling control. That did not make Thune powerless. He could still appeal Vance's ruling. He could negotiate. He could attempt to preserve part of his scheduling authority by agreeing to a specific date and persuading Lee to withdraw the motion. But each option now began from the same fact. Lee had already acted, and Vance had already ruled. Thune could respond to that reality. He could no longer erase it. That matters because the 6 previous failed attempts had allowed the central dispute to remain blurred. Was the problem the votes? Was it timing? Was it leadership strategy? Was it internal Republican resistance? Was the bill simply waiting for the right procedural vehicle? Wednesday stripped away part of that uncertainty. The floor now had a pending motion. The chair had issued a ruling. And according to the numbers presented in this fight, supporters were working with the 51 votes they believed were necessary to move through the reconciliation route. So the pressure shifted again. If Thune allowed the ruling to stand and permitted the process to continue, the Save America Act moved toward the floor battle its supporters had been demanding. If he challenged the ruling, the fight moved to a different kind of vote, one that could expose exactly where Republican senators stood when asked whether Lee's procedural pathway should survive. Neither outcome resembled the old pattern of simply pushing the decision deeper into the calendar. That was Lee's leverage, and Vance had made it credible. Before Wednesday, supporters could threaten to force the issue. After Wednesday, the vice president had demonstrated that he was willing to recognize the mechanism Lee was trying to use. That changes every negotiation that follows. A promise to schedule the bill later now has to compete with a motion that has already been recognized. A request for more time now comes with the possibility of an appeal vote. And another delay now risks becoming something much harder to explain 6 weeks before the midterms. Not a disagreement over timing, but a recorded decision about whether the Senate should continue down the pathway already opened. For Thune, that is the calculation. He has spent months trying to keep a conference with real internal divisions from being forced into exactly this kind of binary choice. His job has been to find a route that could preserve enough unity to move without detonating the disagreements underneath it. Lee's maneuver compressed those choices. Move, appeal, negotiate, but respond. That is where the Senate stood Wednesday night. 51 votes were part of the equation. Vance's ruling was in the record. Lee's motion was pending. And a majority leader who had started the day controlling the calendar was now confronting a procedural challenge that had been placed before the chamber without his authorization. The final question was no longer whether Mike Lee could create pressure. It was no longer whether J.D. Vance would be willing to act from the chair. The remaining question belonged to John Thune. When the Senate came back into session Thursday morning, would he accept the new reality and put the Save America Act on a defined path toward a vote? Or would he appeal Vance's ruling and force the Republican conference to answer the question publicly? That choice would decide whether Wednesday's procedural breakthrough became actual movement or the beginning of an even more direct confrontation on the Senate floor. Tierndo, 100%. By the time the Senate adjourned Wednesday night, the fight had been reduced to a much simpler equation than the one Republicans had been managing for the previous 18 months. There was a motion pending. There was a ruling from the chair. There were 51 votes in the equation. And there was a majority leader who could no longer control the next stage simply by leaving the bill off the calendar. Thursday morning at 10 became the next decisive point. Thune could accept the procedural reality Vance had created and move toward a defined floor schedule. He could challenge the ruling and send the question to the full Senate. Or he could strike an agreement with Lee that preserved some measure of leadership control while still putting the Save America Act on a specific path forward. What he could not do was return the Senate to where it had been before 2:43 Wednesday afternoon. The filing had already been entered. Vance had already ruled. Lee had already demonstrated that the majority leader's scheduling preference was not the only procedural lever available in this fight. That is what separated this moment from every previous round. The argument was no longer simply about whether enough Republicans supported the bill. That question had already shaped months of negotiations. The argument was no longer simply about whether there was some theoretical route through Senate procedure. Lee had put one in front of the chair, and Vance had sustained it. The argument now was whether John Thune would allow that pathway to produce an actual floor vote or challenge it and force the Republican conference to decide publicly whether the ruling should survive. Either choice carried consequences. Accept the ruling, and the Save America Act moves closer to the vote Arama supporters had been demanding. Appeal it, and senators who had previously been able to hide inside timing disputes and procedural ambiguity could be pushed into a recorded vote. Negotiate, and Thune would still have to offer enough certainty to convince Lee to give up a motion he had already succeeded in getting recognized. That is why Wednesday's move mattered. It did not pass the bill. It did not end Republican opposition. It did not eliminate the institutional argument over how far a vice president's recognition authority should extend. And it did not guarantee what would happen Thursday morning. What it did was remove the comfort of indefinite delay. For 18 months, supporters could pressure leadership, threaten consequences, make speeches, count votes, and demand action. But until Wednesday, the final decision still came back to one question: when would John Thune allow the Senate to move? Mike Lee changed that sequence. He acted first. J.D. Vance backed the move from the chair. And Thune was left reacting to a procedural reality that already existed. That is the battlefield now. A majority leader trying to preserve control. A senator who has found a mechanism to challenge it. A vice president who has already shown he is willing to use the authority Lee asked him to use. And a Republican conference that may now have to choose between moving the Save America Act forward and creating a public record of who stopped the procedural path that could carry it there. The next answer will not come from another promise about September. It will come from what Thune does when the chamber opens. Does he accept Vance's ruling and schedule the fight? Does he appeal and force every senator to take a side? Or does he negotiate before the confrontation reaches that point? After 18 months of delay, the central question has finally narrowed to a decision that cannot stay hidden behind the calendar. Thursday morning, John Thune has to make it. And whatever he chooses will determine whether Wednesday's ruling becomes the breakthrough supporters have been waiting for or the vote that exposes exactly where the resistance still stands.